Is that vote climate change stand part of the schedule? Nikki Wagner.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm delighted to take this opportunity to speak in the estimates debate on climate change. It's well understood that climate change is one of the most difficult issues for governments today. So it's to the enormous credit of the Minister of Climate Change, the Dr. Honourable Nick Smith, that New Zealand's modified ETS has been introduced so smoothly, and that in a relatively short time it has so effectively changed investment patterns in our economy. New Zealand introduced its emissions trading scheme because it is the lowest cost way to reduce our emissions on greenhouse gases. As an environmentally aware country with a clean green brand, we need to be serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And putting a price on carbon is the most credible and least costly way to reduce emissions. That's because the ETS passes on the costs of reducing emissions to emitters, as they are the best placed to find the most cost-effective way of doing this. So how well is our ETS done? Well, forestry entered into the scheme in 2008, and since then there's been a sharp switch from deforestation to afforestation. Deforestation hit a record of 4,000 hectares between 2005 and 2008, but since forestry entered the scheme, new forest plantings have grown each year, with 8,000 hectares expected in 2011. This change reflects both the significant cost of permanently removing forests, but also the valuable income stream of new forests from the ETS. The increase in forestation has had a dramatic impact on New Zealand's net emissions, and it is essential to meeting our Kyoto obligations over the period 2008 to 2012. On July 1st, 2010, energy, transport and industry entered the scheme. Emissions from electricity have grown 130% since 1990, and that's the largest increase in any sector. But the ETS has changed that. In 2010, the industry achieved a 12-year high in renewable generation, 79%.
Sorry, point of order.
Listening very carefully to the speech, but I haven't heard estimates mentioned yet. We've had a wonderful history about the ETS that Labor introduced, but we haven't heard yet about estimates, which is a budget debate for vote climate change.
I think the member has been talking about current things which are in the estimate. She should perhaps make the comparative illustration, but she hasn't been too far from the mark. But it is just a caution to all members. This is the estimates. Okay?
Point of order.
Yeah, point of order.
Again, sir, with respect, as you would quite rightly concur, the estimates are forward-looking documents as to how the government proposes to spend public funds. Whilst I'm sure the ETS forms part of that, to give us a history lesson in respect of the ETS and talk about industry and how many forests have been felled and what have you, it's about how the government proposes to spend money, sir, and the member has been round long enough, bore aside, to work that through.
Yeah, and I've cautioned the member. Our current policy is relevant, but the whole speech should not dwell on that. It's really the estimates that we're referring to. Nikki Wagner.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I think it's particularly relevant that the costs of forestation will make sure that we do meet the Kyoto Protocol, which would be very expensive for our government when we look at the 2008 to 2012 period. But I'd also like to focus on the fact of renewable generation. And I think it's important that we understand that increased renewables will help us in the future in managing our carbon footprint. The growth of renewables have increased, and I think we've already mentioned in the House that 1,340 megawatts of renewable generating capacity has been consented in the past year, and no fossil fuel plants. Now that's a five-fold increase in renewables compared to the last decade, and that will help us manage that cost of carbon. During the last 12 months, the ETS has performed well, and we expect it to continue to do so. Actual emissions have proved to be significantly less than those estimated, and it was expected that over the first reporting period, the combined industrial, electricity and transport sectors would have emitted approximately 18.8 million tonnes, but actually emissions were only 16.3 million tonnes, and that means that our liability is absolutely decreased. We can clearly see that a price on carbon has now been factored into the New Zealand's economy, and that this price is helping us achieve the government's goal of reducing emissions and managing the costs of New Zealand's international climate change obligations. And I'd just like to reflect on the fact that New Zealanders do enjoy our beautiful country, they do appreciate its great outdoors, and they are very keen to do their bit towards managing climate change, even if it is costing them. And I think the ETS is helpful in this.
Mr. Chairman.
Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr. Chairman, I'm delighted to talk in these estimates on climate change. And doesn't it speak volumes about the level of confidence there is in the government's policy around climate change that neither the Green Party or the Labour Party want to take a single call? I think that says that the policy is actually in really robust shape, that there's a high level of confidence about the government's policies, and ultimately they're working. And let me go through a number of ways in which they are working and in terms of how that will flow through to 2011. One of the key objectives for the government is to reverse the awful deforestation that occurred during the previous government. And in this year that we are dealing with, officials estimate that there will be 5,700 additional hectares of forest. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's compare how that works. In the previous decade, there was a huge increase in deforestation. The worst period of deforestation since record begins in the 1930s was under the previous government. So when we introduced our policies around climate change, we wanted to reverse that, and we've achieved just that with an increase in afforestation every single year that we have been the government, and that's continuing on into this year. A second key objective for the government and our climate change policies is that we think we should be producing more of our energy from renewables. New Zealand is actually more privileged than most countries in that regard. What's actually happened, Mr. Speaker, is during the term of the previous government, we saw a constant decline in the proportion of electricity that was renewable. Most of the power stations that were built under Labour were thermal fossil fuel power stations. Now, in the last year, we've seen a huge improvement in that regard. It's this impressive. A five-fold increase, that's a 500% increase in the amount of consenting for renewable. It is very unbelievable. Mr. Burns says it's unbelievably good, and that's what you get under a national government. Now, the interesting thing is this, is that in terms of this future year, we are expecting, and the government is budgeting, to see an ongoing improvement in that proportion of renewables, and that is to be celebrated. The third element is, of course, and this is absolutely pivotal to the estimates, Mr. Chairman, what is going to be the cost to taxpayers of meeting our Kyoto obligations? Again, let me show you how it works. Under the Labour government, emissions increased by 23%. This was the government that campaigned on carbon neutral, that said when they came to government they were going to reduce emissions by 20%.
I again repeat that this is estimates about the budget. I haven't heard one word about budget investments since this year of 2011.
I'm going to overrule that. I think the member is making comparisons and projecting, looking forward. I think that he is in the zone.
They are so sensitive because their record is just so ugly. And let me tell you the advice. My advice when I became minister was that if that emissions track continued, the cost to the New Zealand taxpayer of meeting our Kyoto obligations was going to be 400...
Point of order. Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr. Speaker, I just simply ask for your clarification. in responding to my colleagues and giving a ruling to my colleagues' question about relevance or estimates, you made a comment in respect, which I assume means that the Minister was adhering to standing orders by talking about forward-looking estimates, but you used what we could probably call new parliamentary language and said he was in the zone. And I'm just wanting you to interpret that for us, please.
That's rather trivial. The member has surmised correctly.
The key issue in the estimates, how much is the New Zealand taxpayer going to have to pay for New Zealand to meet its Kyoto obligations? And the answer is actually absolutely not a penny. Do you know why? In the first 2 years of the emissions trading scheme, emissions have stopped going up, they've gone down. And they've gone down so well, Mr. Speaker, that New Zealand is going to comfortably meet its Kyoto targets, and that is absolutely good news for the taxpayer. Because rather than having to write out a cheque for $485 million to countries around the world, $485 million would have been the cost to New Zealand without the emissions trading scheme. As a consequence of having it in place, emissions are down, we're meeting our targets, and that is extra good news. Extra good news. And while the Maori Party's in the House, I want to acknowledge that the only way this government's been able to get that scheme up and running, get emissions down, get the investment in forestry, get the investment in renewable energy, is because the Maori Party had the wisdom to back a sensible, pragmatic emissions trading scheme that's working for New Zealand, that's working for Maori, and is ensuring we meet our environmental obligations. And I just simply say how proud this government is of the sensible progress it's made, and over the course of dealing with the ETS review and working forward, Mr. Speaker, our objective is to maintain that balance of minimising costs and maximising progress on this important issue.
The question is that vote climate change stand part of the schedule. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that vote environment stand part of the schedule. Louise Upson.